As I said, I want to welcome Dan Hoard to our class. He has spoken to this class before, but I had the honor of working with Dan, as I mentioned, at Fox 19. Dan has done play-by-play for baseball. He's done play-by-play for basketball. Right now, he does play-by-play for the Bengals, for UC football, University of Cincinnati football, University of Cincinnati basketball. He has a game tonight, so we're very thrilled that he's taking time to talk to us today because those of you who do play-by-play and do game prep know that day of the game, that's what you do as you prepare for that broadcast, that game later on that day. So, Dan, thank you so much for being with us. I guess before we get into questions and the nuts and bolts about play-by-play, I just want you to start talking about how you got into this. When did you realize that A, you wanted to do this, and B, you had a talent to do that? And then how did you take that information and say, okay, how am I going to find this job? What am I going to do? So, start, as they say, start at the beginning and tell us about your career and how you got going.
I wanted to be a sports broadcaster from birth, and that's really only a slight exaggeration. I joke that the doctor pulled me out of my mother's womb, slapped me on the ass, and infant Dan Hoard said that's 15 yards for unsportsmanlike conduct. So I don't know why this was my dream, quite honestly. My dad was an upholsterer. My stepfather, who really raised me, was a wholesale florist. So I am not the son of an announcer. I really had no family ties to the business. But from a really early age, this was what I knew I wanted to do. My childhood heroes were the announcers as much as the athletes. I grew up near Buffalo, New York. They had a famous sportscaster in town there named Van Miller, who basically did everything in Buffalo during my childhood. He was the voice of the Buffalo Bills. He was on the news at 6 and 11. He did the Buffalo Braves games when they had existed. That was the NBA team in Buffalo in the 1970s. That's the Clippers now. He hosted a game show on local TV. So he was my guy. I was just enamored with Van Miller and trying to follow in his footsteps. So when I was really young, I started to do anything I could think of to try to get into this business. So the assignment that Betsy has given you for a week from today was what I did as a kid. I got a cassette tape recorder back when that was the standard technology. I would turn the sound on down on the TV, and almost every day I was the voice of one of the Buffalo teams. So I was doing Bills games off the TV on Sunday. I was doing the Buffalo Braves NBA games off the TV on weeknights. I was doing the Buffalo Sabres into my little tape recorder. Buffalo didn't have a major league team, but we got the Mets and Yankees on cable where I grew up. So I was doing mostly Mets games into a tape recorder. I mean, this was the geekly routine of my childhood. And it's funny because a few years ago, at the height of COVID, most teams weren't able to travel their announcers. So it was a flashback to my childhood. When the Bengals played on the road during the height of COVID, I was in a booth back in Cincinnati calling the game off a TV screen. So my career kind of came full circle. So those were some of the things I started to do at an early age. And then as I got older, when I was in high school, for example, I joined the debate club to get practice in public speaking. I went to the local radio station in my tiny hometown of Jamestown, New York, and said, what can I do? Can I volunteer to do anything for free here at the station? Eventually, I read scripture on a weekly show called The Radio Chapel, where they would bring in local ministers and priests to give a sermon that would then play on Sunday mornings on the radio. And I was the designated read the scripture guy. So all of these little things helped me eventually, get a job in the business. I went to Syracuse for my college education. As many of you know, Syracuse is kind of known as Sportscaster U. If this is really what you want to do, that's a great place to go. Not necessarily because of the college education and the professors that I had, they were fine, but spending 4 years around like-minded students who were really talented and really wanted to get into the business was tremendous training for me. It was very competitive to get slots on the student radio stations and the student TV station. And that kind of prepared me for the business because you got a sense of just how committed you have to be in order to advance in this career. So that's kind of the brief history of how I decided to get into this and some of the things that I did to try to get ahead. And then, once I got that first job, then my career was off and running.
So tell us about that first job.
So when I was a sophomore at Syracuse, I was hired to be the assistant general manager of a minor league baseball team in the New York Penn League called the New York Mets. That sounds like a prestigious gig, assistant GM of a minor league baseball season as a college sophomore. Well, it was a two-man staff. So I was the second guy on the totem pole. And I took the job because part of the job was getting the opportunity to broadcast a handful of the games on the radio. So for the most part, I was popping popcorn. I was cleaning up the stadium after games. I was walking from business to business before the season began, trying to sell ads in the program and on stadium signs and things like that. But really, I took it in order to broadcast a handful of games. And that was a really good experience for me, particularly the sales aspect of it. A lot of times when you first get started, particularly as a radio play-by-play announcer, part of the job will be trying to sell the broadcasts. And it was nothing that I enjoyed doing, I can tell you that, but it was good training because you're often expected to do that in the early stages of your career. So that was the first gig that I had. And then when I was a senior at Syracuse, I was hired to be the play-by-play announcer for the local AAA baseball team, the Syracuse Chiefs, which at the time was the top minor league farm club for the Toronto Blue Jays. And that was an awesome experience for me because I did the games alone. It was 144 games in 152 days. And just the sheer number of reps, night after night, game after game. Game could be 3 hours, it could be 6 hours. I had a stretch of 9 days where I did 21 and 27 inning games alone, 9 days apart. So if you can get through that and try to keep it interesting and informative, nothing prepares you for the business better than experiences like that.
And I trust that your voice held up after all that.
Yeah, it did. I'm lucky in that respect. So I've been doing this for a long time, and there have been a handful of occasions, unfortunately, where I have come down with laryngitis. It's happened maybe 2 or 3 times in all the years that I've been doing this, but for the most part, the voice is held out. I'd like to say that I treat it very carefully like an opera singer or something like that. I really don't. I'm just lucky that it's a resilient muscle in my case. Going to knock on wood and
Yes,
hope that
please do.
continues
Yeah.
tonight. The
Knock on
basketball
wood.
game coming up later tonight.
Yeah.
I try to drink a normal amount of water, I guess, but aside from that, I probably don't take care of it as carefully as I should.
Well, and that's one thing that as we get on in this class, we'll talk a lot about it. You got to drink water, but you can't drink too much because there's no guarantee that you're going to be able to go down the hall at halftime. So you've
That's
got to,
true.
balance that. You've got to figure out how to keep your energy up. You got to eat. You got to keep going. Just, little things like that, physically you don't necessarily think about, okay, how am I going to get through these 3 hours? But you have to do things like that. You have to pace yourself. You have to have water.
Yeah.
You have to eat. You have to, keep going and get your energy up because it's so important for a play-by-play person to convey the energy that's going on the field, on the court. You have to convey it to us, the listeners, because, 9 times out of 10, you'll be doing radio. And so you have to be our eyes and ears. How do you, or how did you learn to be that descriptive? I think, when we're listening to a game and like it's a basketball game and tip off, here's what they're wearing, UC is going right to left on your dial. Uh, where did you learn to get that descriptive to make sure that, we have that mental picture as they're playing? Okay, I know what they're wearing and I know what direction they're going on the court.
Honestly, I think play by play is a bit of a knack. I think some people are kind of born with that ability to do it. I think that's true to a certain extent with me, but it is something that I've studied and think about a lot. When I talked about my 4 years at Syracuse hanging out with these like-minded students, we would watch sporting events together and pick apart the announcers more than we would even watch the games. So if me and a handful of my wannabe sports announcer buddies were watching an NFL game and there happened to be other friends that were in the dorm room or whatever campus apartment watching the game with us, these other friends would be like, could you guys shut up, please, and just enjoy the game? Do we have to pick apart every sentence that the announcers are saying? But that's what we did because we were just really into the business. So while I do think some of my ability to describe a game is just something that, I was born with or maybe developed through those childhood instances of practicing into a tape recorder, it is something that I've studied and think about a lot. What makes Kevin Harlan, for example, the greatest football radio announcer of all time? I have him number one on my totem pole. And if you listen to Kevin do a game on the radio, so I'm not talking about his TV work, which is also exceptional, but a football game on the radio. He does the Super Bowl every year on the radio. His ability to take you to that stadium and make you feel like you're there is unprecedented. He's just incredibly descriptive. He uses his voice like a Stradivarius. So I listen to people like that, and you're not trying to copy them necessarily, but there are things that I pick up from really any good announcer that I listen to. And again, it's not anything that I then say, okay, the next game I'm going to do that. But I do think subconsciously in the back of your head, you hear things that then later, it might be a month down the road, it might be 5 years down the road, maybe you'll use at the appropriate moment. So the descriptiveness, the attention to detail, the trying to paint that visual picture for somebody who's listening in their car or can't be in front of the TV. That's the challenge. That's what I love doing. That's why I enjoy broadcasting games on the radio so much. And again, it's something that I think about a lot. It's something that I'm always trying to do better. I'll listen back to a little bit of almost all of my broadcasts. It might be 5 minutes, 10 minutes, but just a few minutes to try to think, okay, was that descriptive enough? Am I being too repetitive in the way that I describe certain things? How can I make this a little bit better the next time around?
Yeah. And that's a really good point. You can learn so much by going back and watching. And a lot of times it's painful, but if you watch and you could pick up things that maybe you didn't notice in the heat of the moment that you were doing or maybe not doing. So that's a really good point. As I mentioned, tonight is a game night as UC plays Colorado, Big 12 action. So walk me through your preparation for this game from talking with SIDs, talking with coaches, to getting your chart, getting your information. Walk me through your preparation for tonight's game.
So, as the announcer for a particular team, in my case, the University of Cincinnati basketball team, I don't have to do the homework on two teams for every game. I've seen every UC game, I've been to a million practices. So, for the Cincinnati part of it, that's already locked into my brain. I'll update the chart that I use for UC, update the stats. If there's something late breaking or newsworthy about Cincinnati, I'll have that down. But most of my work leading up to the game tonight is about the opponent. They have not played Colorado yet this year. So I've spent the last couple of days learning about Colorado. So what does that mean? It means watching their most recent game and then preparing my chart for the Buffaloes. So I've got it here in front of me. And every announcer does this a little bit differently. The way I do it is pretty simple, but it works for me. And I think that's kind of the way you have to approach it if you're going to become a play-by-play announcer. You can talk to other announcers, There are things online that show how people make their charts. You might be able to buy it from somebody if you want to. But I have this very basic piece of paper that has kind of some boxes and lines on it that I just sketched out many, many years ago. And from this, I do my chart for that night's opponent. So here is Colorado. You've got players listed down this series of boxes. And in that section, you've got their name, height, weight, hometown, some nuggets that are interesting about them that probably won't make it into the broadcast. Maybe 5% do, most of it doesn't, but you never know which 5% based on who's having a good or bad game. I also include the career highs in this little box. So that's not something that I have to look up in the notes during the course of a game. If a guy's got a great game going, he scored 28 points, and you might want to know, well, is that a career high? It's there, so I can find it instantaneously. In this middle section with the big box, I've got their stats. And during the course of the game, I'm going to keep a running total of how many points they have. During the broadcast, anytime a guy scores, I give his updated point total. That's interesting to me as a listener. So I always include that as a broadcaster. And when I'm listening to a broadcast and the announcers don't tell me how many points the guy has, it drives me crazy because as a listener, again, that's something I want to know. So I keep it myself. I'm not relying on a stat monitor for that. You have stat monitors at the college level, but you might wind up doing high school games someday where that's not available. It's great to be able to keep it on your own. So I keep a running tally of their points. This final box, I've got the numbers 1 through 5. That's for their fouls. When they get a personal foul, I X that out, which one, so I know how many fouls that they have. So that's my chart. That's what I will use for the game tonight for Colorado. I still have several hours left between now and game time where I can do more homework, and I plan to do that. I might watch another Colorado game, and then I'll get to the arena really early to talk to our coaches, to interview our head coach for the pregame show, and just try to get more and more comfortable about, the storylines and the key players for the opposing team between now and 6:30 when I go on the air.
You mentioned the pregame show. That's one thing that so many play-by-play announcers kind of, the other duties is assigned. Uh, you will do pre-games, you will do post-games, you will do the coaches show sometimes in the middle of the week. There are other responsibilities you have because really you become the face of the program. You're the person who introduces coaches at different events and things like that. So let me bring up earlier this month, UC had a tough loss at West Virginia. And Wes Miller, the UC coach, comes over for the post-game show. And I'm sure you have all listened to post-game shows and pre-game and post-game, it's pretty softball. This is not 60 minutes. You're just, how to go, coach. It's not an interrogation. Coach Miller, if you have followed UC basketball, has been under some pressure. UC fans expect a lot of winning, and this is, I think, a pivotal year. And you can talk more about that, Dan, a pivotal year for him. But you basically said, "Hi, coach," and he went off. Not at you, but just kind of at the universe. And it's us against the world and all this social media chatter and blah, 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 blah. And I'm sure you were sitting there a little bit surprised and kind of shaking your head. But how do you handle that? Because it wasn't directed at you. And a couple of days later, he apologized and all that. But in the heat of the moment, in a tough game that it would have been nice for UC to win, they didn't. How do you, as a broadcaster, as the interviewer, how do you handle that?
Well, it was interesting because after that, a lot of people did reach out and more or less say, like, how dare he come after you? And I told them, have a little empathy for the guy. He's fighting for his job, he's fighting for his team. They had just had two absolutely devastating gut punch losses in 4 days. And part of his job responsibility is to walk out of the locker room like 10 minutes after the game is over, come over to where we are broadcasting courtside, sit down with me and my partner, Terry Nelson, and, face the heat. So, in the midst of something like that, you let them vent. And then you do try to serve the listeners. So in those post-game interviews, really what I'm thinking about is what does my audience most want to know? I've probably got time for three questions with the coach before the SID is going to take him to his next post-game responsibility, which is probably a news conference with the other reporters. So in that time period, again, what does my audience most want to know? What happened in this key situation at the end of the game? Why did you bench this guy or that guy? Whatever it might be for the particular game. So in that instance, after he vented essentially and got what he wanted to say off his chest, then I just tried to kind of calmly ask him the key questions that needed to be asked after that tough loss. And to his credit, he answered all of them fine. But what got traction in Cincinnati and nationally on some websites was this rant. And he felt badly about it afterward. Again, you mentioned he apologized publicly. He also called me the next day and apologized privately. I told him he didn't have to. He's been great with me every day he's been on the job. But again, it's part of his responsibility to go trucking out there a few minutes after, the latest devastating loss. And he's had a bunch of them this year. And there's a reason why coaches are granted a cool down period
Yeah.
so they can avoid moments like that. But sometimes, the emotion of the moment kind of overwhelms them and they don't take advantage of that 10-minute cool down period and kind of come to grips with their emotions. And unfortunately for Coach Miller, that's what happened in that game.
And we have seen it at Notre Dame. Coach Shrewsbury kind of lost his cool at a road game. And again, the pressure that these coaches face, especially now. The worst thing I think that ever happened to coaches is IU and Coach Sig, because he took the worst program in the country and took them to the national championship. So now every athletic director and every fan will say, oh, you only need 2 years to turn this around. And so that just amps the pressure for any of these coaches that, okay, I don't get my 5 year grace period, I get 2 years. And yeah, I mean, the pressure that these folks face, I would not wish that on anybody.
It's
So,
brutal.
oh,
Yeah,
it
it's brutal,
is.
particularly in the social media era.
Yeah.
People typically are not kind on Twitter or Instagram or whatever. They vent. Every day it's fire the coach. Every time any coach loses, it's all about fire the coach, fire about the AD, fire the AD. Um, it's part of the job. It's one of the reasons why they're paid what they're paid.
Yeah.
But it's not a fun part of the job when you're losing. And unfortunately, this year, Cincinnati, they're 500. They were expected to be much better. So it's been a rough year for our head coach.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Speaking of, in November, um, UC basketball played Louisville on a Friday and lost. On Saturday, UC football played BYU. Big, I mean, it was a nationally promoted game and lost. Sunday, the Bengals played New England, I believe, and lost. Now, I'm not blaming all that on you.
Thank
And
you.
and and later on that night, FC Cincinnati lost. So it was like a horrible weekend for any Cincinnati fan. But, I always say that, we're fans or we wouldn't be in sports. We are fans or we wouldn't be doing this. Yes, you're in a job, you're down the middle. As a Bengals broadcaster, you get excited when the Bengals do something, but you have three different teams, three different losses, and you and I have lived through, the dark ages of the Bengals back in the 1990s and 2000s. What does that do to you? I mean, just loss after loss after loss. And I know what it does to me as a fan, but what does it do to you because you're there? And there was one particular game, I think early in October, and I was listening to you and Dave Lapham, former player for the Bengals, is the caller. And I remember you both were talking about whoever the Bengals were playing that day. You expressed your frustration that every pass in the middle, and the Bengals couldn't stop it because they didn't have any players in the middle who could stop it at that particular time. But you both express frustration over that. Why can't they stop that? They're seeing that they're doing it. Why can't they stop that? As, yes, a fan of these, as an employee of these teams, how do you handle it as a broadcaster? Like, man, that is a lost weekend.
Betsy, it's one of the great things about my job because if you are the announcer on TV for ESPN or CBS or Fox or whatever, you have to be completely down the middle. Fans of either team don't think that you are. They always perceive some sort of bias, but you really do have to be down the middle. I don't have to be down the middle. I am broadcasting Cincinnati Bengals games mostly to Cincinnati Bengals fans as the voice of the team on the radio. Same with the University of Cincinnati. Now, that's not to say that I am an over the top homer. That's not my style at all. It works for some people. That's just not the way I do it. But clearly, I want my teams to win. So that's one of the reasons why I like my job so much. I have an emotional stake in the outcome. When they win, I'm elated. When they lose, I'm devastated, just like the fans. The difference is I've got another game the next day or maybe 3 days later. So I can't let it linger. So after the Bengals, lost the Super Bowl or one of the really huge games during my tenure, again, in the immediate aftermath afterward, I am devastated. By the next day, just like the players and coaches, you got to move on. There's another game. So that's how I approach it. During the situation you described, 3 losses in 3 days, people were like, "Are you going to jump off a bridge?" No, there's another game a few days from now. It hurts. It sucked. I wish they had won. They could have won. They should have won. Tough. They didn't. So you move on and you get ready to broadcast the next game. And maybe that makes it a little bit easier as a fan of these teams that I can't let it linger. The players can't let it
Yeah.
linger. If, I know there's some people in this Zoom that are athletes. If you have a bad performance or the team loses, you can't let it ruin your season. You got to go back to work the next day and try to perform better the next time out. So to me, that's kind of how I approach it as a broadcaster. I'm glad that I have this emotional stake. It makes the job more fun to me, but win or lose, there's another game a few days later, and I kind of have to flush that emotion, win or lose, and move on and prepare for the next game.
Mhm. And I do think athletes bounce back much quicker than fans do because they do know, okay, there's another game we got to prepare for, something else that we got to look forward to.
Correct.
I want to open it up for some questions. I can't see everybody at the same time here on Zoom. So if you have a question, just go ahead and unmute and ask a quick question if you would, because I want to make sure that we have plenty of time if anybody wants to follow up. Anybody have a question?
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead, Con.
I'm Cooper. So you've called like a lot of big sporting events like the Super Bowl since you went to the college football playoff a few years back. I've struggled with this. Like when you get to call those big events, you often think it's like, oh, just a part of the job, just another thing. But are you able to like take a step back and appreciate, oh, I just called a Super Bowl. Like what is your advice to make sure like you can like take a step back and appreciate I'm doing something like not a lot of people get to do and it's really cool.
Yeah. It's a really good question, Cooper. I describe broadcasting the Super Bowl as the scene in the first Jurassic Park movie. So Sam Neill is riding in the like open Jeep, and the Jeep stops, and he takes his glasses and he's like, because he's seeing the dinosaurs exist, right? That's what broadcasting a Super Bowl was like. So in the booth, just before we went on the air, I'm thinking to myself, holy crap, I'm about to broadcast a Super Bowl. But then the event begins, and you rely on the training and all of the games that you've ever done just to try to do the job as well as you possibly can. But I do appreciate that I've had those opportunities. I certainly hope to call a winning Super Bowl at some point. I hope to be the guy in Cincinnati whose call gets remembered for years and years. That moment at the end of the game, saying whatever you say in that moment. And I haven't had that chance. I've been close. You mentioned University of Cincinnati made the 14 playoff. That was a month before the Bengals played in the Super Bowl. So I had a really good year in 2021. The University of Cincinnati went to the NCAA tournament many, many years in a row in the early portion of my tenure. Never got past the Sweet 16. So I hope before I'm finished, I will call a championship at some point. I've had conference titles and things like that, but I've never called a team that won the ultimate championship. And that's really the moment that all of us dream about.
Anybody else with a question?
Hi, Dan. Thank you so much for the time. My name is Chris, and I was curious, I mean, for you, especially, being in the industry and us all as young people, how imperative is it to, do well on social media, especially when looking for, these new opportunities?
I think it's really important. I am somewhat active on social media. I've got a relatively big Twitter following, but a lot of people my age, particularly at the top of the totem pole, don't engage in it, probably because they don't have to. I think it's an important part of my job to interact with my fan base. But if I were your age, I would be all over it because I do think that that's kind of a way to make a name for yourself. Are you putting content out there? Um, are you developing contacts and a following? I think it's critical. So which platform you choose, how many you choose, that's up to you. But I do think it's really important to be active on social media, particularly if you are looking to generate content. I think it's a way to get your stuff out there and get people to see some of the abilities that you have. So I would take advantage of, any opportunity that you have to do that.
Thank you.
And the one thing, especially if you're looking at local media markets, if you're applying for sports jobs there, more than one news director will admit that they will look at the social media following, who has the most social media followers, and that goes into their decision of who they're going to hire. And that's, that is the way of the world. But putting together strategically, putting together content up there that shows that you're passionate about a sport, you're an expert at the sport, and tag anybody and everybody that you know. You never know who's going to see that. So it's just another way for you to get. And I know, Chris, you do a lot of that now, but just making sure that people in the business see what you're doing and you show them that, yeah, I know what I'm talking about. And so, that's all very important. Any other questions? We still got a
Uh,
few minutes.
yeah,
Yeah,
I
go
have a
ahead.
question. Hi, Dan. I'm Ellie. So we've had a privilege for being like at Notre Dame and some of our other sports classes that are offered here to hear from some other guest speakers that have worked for teams. And the question that always comes up is kind of how do you keep morale up when maybe you're going through like a losing period? I'm just curious, especially like as an announcer, how to keep fans engaged when you yourself are a fan. And I know you've touched on it like a
Yeah.
little bit, but
Yeah.
specifically.
Yeah. Part of it in my case honestly is just my own personality. I am kind of a glass half full person in general. So when my teams are losing, and I've had plenty of bad teams. I've been lucky. I've had some really good teams, but I've had in my minor league baseball years, I mean, I had terrible teams that won one third of the time. And that's a daily basis where you're now going back on the air for this team that stinks. But every broadcast is its own story. You never know what's going to happen. Even a bad team will have tremendous games, great highlights, great moments. So I approach every broadcast as its own entity. And that night might be the greatest game that any of us have ever seen. So I try to just bring that enthusiasm into the booth every day, every night. Yeah, maybe this year our team's not that good, but there are better days ahead. And again, for this broadcast, this night, it might be awesome. So that's the energy I'm going to channel into our game tonight against Colorado. UC is 0-3 in the Big 12. All three games were games they had a chance to win with 3 minutes to go and didn't. They lost their most recent game on a shot with 11 seconds to go after they took the lead with 30 seconds to go. They're so close. So that's kind of the vibe I'm going to hit the air with tonight. Tonight's the night. This is the night they can get over the hump. Maybe they can start a great winning streak and get back into contention in the Big 12. And hopefully the audience appreciates that and it lifts their spirits a little bit. And, we'll see how the game goes. Maybe by the end of the night, they're back in the doldrums because it didn't go well, but hope springs eternal.
Uh, and you mentioned Terry Nelson, your broadcast partner there. And you guys have been together several years, many years. You had a legendary broadcast partner there for the longest time. How important is it to have that connection, that chemistry with your broadcast partner, especially when you get into games like this, especially when, I always say if it's a blowout one way or the other, you start reading off recipes because there's nothing else to talk about. How important it is to have that connection with your broadcast partner when you do games?
Well, it's really helpful. And I've been lucky because I can honestly say I've never had a broadcast partner that I didn't like, that didn't become a close friend. All of these people are some of my closest friends. So you mentioned Dave Lapham. We've been doing the Bengals games together for 15 years. It hasn't been quite as long with Terry Nelson on UC basketball, but before that, I worked with a guy named Chuck Mayshock for many, many years, who was like a grandfather to me. So I've been lucky. That's not always the case. I know of several broadcasting tandems where as soon as the game is over, they go their separate ways. They don't say a word to each other. They don't like each other. They badmouth each other off the air. And then as a listener, it's hard to tell sometimes. Some people fake that and can pull it off. But I do think it's really helpful and important to try to develop good relationships with your broadcast partners, because if you have one, if you are friends, if there's a connection, I do think that that is evident on the air. If you don't have to fake it, I think the audience can sense it. These two people like each other. They play off each other well. Their senses of humor, work well with each other. So it's something that when I have a new partner, I really work on trying to develop that chemistry, take an interest in them, try to learn about, the things that they like, their interests off the court, off the field, whatever. And you never know when that stuff is going to come up on the air. So I'll broadcast this game with Terry tonight. We've, developed this great friendship, and you never know what part of that friendship might come out in a fun way on the broadcast. I would say it happens almost every time that we go on the air, because we're going to be on the air together for 3 hours tonight. And there will be moments where the game itself is not what you're talking about. And if you have some sort of fun thing between you that you can communicate with the audience and they get a kick out of it, then that's often what the listener remembers most. They'll certainly remember big moments in the game, but humorous moments and things like that are often what, help you make a connection with the audience as well.
Yeah, exactly. Got time for another question. If anybody has a question, you want to jump in?
Hi, Dan. I'm Molly. Thank you for being with us today. I was just curious, you mentioned that broadcasting is like storytelling, telling a story. So, as the narrator of that story, as the announcer, how do you balance keeping kind of your spark and your personality in with professionalism?
Well, I do think that, as I said earlier, I don't consider myself like an over the top homer on my broadcasts. I always do try to maintain a level of professionalism. So, I'm never going to like overtly kill the officials, even if I think they got a call wrong. I am not going to, rip our coaches or athletes. You have to be critical when criticism is warranted, but I'll try to make it tactfully critical. Um, I'm not going to belittle somebody on the other team just because, it's the opposition. That's not my style. So I do think there's kind of a fine line between your personality, wanting the team to win, getting excited, all of that, while also maintaining that you've got a job to do and you are a reporter. You're trying to be honest, you're trying to be detailed, and you're also trying to have some fun. So I think over time, and also it's a little bit different based on your own personality, you find that balance for what works for you. And, in my case, I've been doing games for a long time and hope to keep doing it for many years to come. But I think I've kind of found that balance for emoting and getting excited and being an advocate for my teams, but also ultimately being a professional announcer.
Thank you.
All right, time
Hey
for
Dan.
one
Oh,
more. Go ahead.
hey Dan. I'm Henry. Thank you so much for being here. Um, I have a slightly different question, but I think all of us have like an off night, whether we're playing or broadcasting or whatever. When you know that you're kind of in an off night or you're a little bit thrown off by something, how do you get back into the groove or how do you settle yourself into a game when you don't feel like you're fully yourself?
That's a good question. And that does happen. I mean, I have broadcasts where afterward I shake my head thinking like, what happened? Why was I so bad tonight? It happens. I do a lot of games. With the Bengals, with preseason, that's 20. With UC football, that's 13 more. With UC basketball, that's going to be 35 or so. That's a lot of broadcasts, and inevitably some are better than the others. So after the bad ones or during the bad ones, I just try to remind myself, you know what? You're a little bit off. Take a deep breath. Remember the fundamentals. Go back to doing what you've done a million times before, and you'll get back into that groove. And sometimes it's a matter of kind of trying to keep it simple. If I'm having a bad broadcast, maybe I'm stumbling and fumbling more than usual. At that point, just kind of go back to the basics, call a few plays, just like really simply, crisply, and then more of the colorful stuff will come back to you naturally. And that seems to work for me. And I would think that that kind of approach would probably help anybody when you're having a bad broadcast. If you're on TV and you stumble and you get embarrassed because man, that just looked terrible. People are thinking this guy or this gal stinks. Just kind of go back to the basics a little bit. Just do things very simply, normally, and trust that eventually the higher end of your skill set will just kind of naturally come back. And I do think that that works for me, and I imagine it would work for you.
Good advice. Before I let you go, you talked about having more preparation that will ever make it on the air. Um, a few years ago, has it been 4 years now? We had an incident on Monday Night Football when the Bills were playing, and it was something that you can never prepare for. You do prepare for it, but you can never prepare for the fact that a player goes down and they're doing CPR on him on the field. And that is something that we'll be talking about, especially the television broadcast that night. We'll be talking more about it in class. But on the television broadcast, at least you had pictures of what was going on. As you know, up there in the press box, we weren't getting a whole lot of information of what was going on the field.
None.
Yeah.
Zero.
I mean, I was getting texts from people who were watching at home telling
Yeah.
me what was going on because we did not know. So tell me about how you handle that on the radio.
So that was the Damar Hamlin incident, the Bengals and Bills. And as we just said, the flow of information was non-existent, mostly because the NFL didn't really know what was going to happen. I mean, Damar Hamlin's life was obviously in danger. Thankfully, they saved him. He returned to play a year later. It's one of the greatest stories in sports history. But in the booth that night, he goes down. Now the players from both teams form a semicircle around him to shield people from seeing what was taking place. And from our angle in the press box, we were just high enough that at some point, a couple of these bodies that had formed this shield separated just enough that I could peer in between two people and see that they were performing CPR. So that was a huge lump in the throat moment. I never expected to be in a situation where I would see one of the athletes on the field fighting for his or her life. So in our booth that night, we've got a stat man, a spotter, a producer. There are probably 8 people in our NFL booth for a Bengals home game. And they're getting texts, as you described, you were getting texts. And these people are holding up like their phones and showing me that the text they're getting. And as it turns out, all of the information that they're showing me was wrong. All of it, ranging from he's dead to he broke his arm and a bone is sticking out. And that's what is freaking people out so much. So thankfully, thank God, I didn't say any of it on the air. I'm seeing these phones or people are handing me notes with incorrect information. And I just knew, don't say any of it if you don't know it's true. I'm not trying to have a scoop here. I'm not trying to be the first person with the news. I'm just trying to say what's accurate. So I'm on the air with my broadcast partner, Dave Lapham, and we're basically just trying to describe the scene as accurately as we possibly could without saying anything that we didn't know to be a fact. So some of this conversation was very repetitive because there wasn't a lot of new stuff that we could describe. But again, we are basically just being as descriptive as we could be about what we could see in front of us and what we could see on a TV monitor that was in the booth. So players from both teams have formed a semicircle around Damar Hamlin. We can see that medical personnel are performing CPR. And then maybe you go back and describe what happened. T. Higgins caught a pass over the middle. He collided with Damar Hamlin. Hamlin immediately went down. He did not get up. Medical personnel rushed to his side, and within a matter of moments, players formed a circle around him. We can see that players from both sides are consoling each other. Some appear to be crying, things like that, things that you could factually describe from what you could see with your own 2 eyes and what you could see on the TV monitor. And it was just a great reminder for me, never, ever assume that information that somebody is giving you is accurate in a situation like that. It's one thing to give an incorrect stat. That stuff happens. It's very different to describe something that's a matter of life and death and assume that the information that somebody is handing you is accurate. So if, God forbid you're ever in a situation like that, and I hope I never am again, just remember to only report the absolute facts that you know to be true and don't assume anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. We talked a little bit about social media and, posts are there for the clicks. They're clickbaits. People want to antagonize you to click on something that sounds salacious, that sounds, you know, just ridiculous. They don't care. They just want the clicks. So, um, before we go, and I always ask every guest to do this, give some advice. We have a class full of people who some already are doing play-by-play, some already are involved in the broadcast, and some already are involved in sports. Some are not. But give us some advice. If you're interested in this business, what do you suggest? What do you advise students to do to get them ready for when they graduate?
If you want to have an on-air career, get as much practical on-air experience as you possibly can. So whatever Notre Dame has that gives you that opportunity, sign up for every shift that you're allowed to do and do it. And in addition to that, you don't have to be on campus radio or TV or whatever you have in order to get broadcasting experience. I described what I did as a kid, turning down the sound on the TV and practicing. You can do that now. Nobody has to see it, but it does help you develop that skill set. When I was a student at Syracuse, before you got to broadcast a Syracuse basketball game on the campus radio station, you had to go into the stands with a fellow student and broadcast the game into a tape recorder. So me and my friends, there we would be standing in the student section. Everybody else is going bonkers. And we're standing there with little cassette recorders practicing broadcasting and, broadcasting the game. People thought we were idiots, but that's what we did to get experience. And it's a lot different now. You've got YouTube, you've got podcasting, you've got all sorts of avenues to, develop your skill set, practice it, get reps, have people watch and critique. Those are the things that you need to do to have an on-air career. There's never been a better time to get practice at doing this. All of those things did not exist when I was your age. I would have jumped at all of it. So start a podcast, do video content, and have your own YouTube channel. Anything you can do to work on the skill set that you eventually hope to do professionally, take advantages of those opportunities now while you have the time and the ability.
And there are so many opportunities on campus as well. So, Dan Hoard, you're the best. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. If you want to listen to Dan call the game tonight, it's on 700 WLW. Probably can pick that up on the iHeart channel, iHeart app.
Correct. Yep. The iHeartMedia app, just type in 700 WLW. That would be the station. And honestly, it's a radio station with one of the biggest coverage maps of any in the U.S. So on a clear night, we can be heard in 38 states. I'm sure on a clear night, it comes in South Bend, Indiana. So you probably haven't gone to the AM dial on the radio in your car in many, many years at your age. But if you're really bored and you're in the car tonight, sometime between 7 and 9 p.m., go to AM, punch 700, and there's a pretty good chance you will hear the broadcast come in loudly and clearly.
When I was going to school and working up in South Bend, many a night I listened to Reds games on 700 WLW. So it does come in. Dan, thank you so much for your time. Please tell Peg I said hello. And again, thank all the students for being here with us. Your assignment's due next Wednesday. Enjoy the long weekend, and I'll be posting more information about your next assignment next week on our Canvas page. Thanks again, Dan. Thanks. Good luck tonight. Go
My,
Bearcats.
my pleasure. Thanks for having me on. I have a lot of friends on the Notre Dame football coaching staff that came from Cincinnati.
Yes, you
Coach
do.
Freeman, Gino Gaduli, Coach Denbrock, Mike Mickens. There are all sorts of Cincinnati connections on that staff. So if you run into any of them, please tell them the voice of the Bearcats, Dan Hoard, says hi. And I think those guys know that when my team is out, I'm a Notre Dame fan. So I'm rooting for those guys to, you know, get invited to the playoff next year as they deserve to be this year.
I don't know if you saw the T-shirt that I think Cincy shirts or no Barstool Sports. I got a T-shirt that said Catholics versus committee. So I may have to break that out sometime. So
That's a good one.
I
I
know.
like it.
All
I
right.
don't know if it'll be a 30 for 30 someday, but it's a good one.
Yeah, probably not. So Dan, thank you. Everybody in the class, thank you. Enjoy the long weekend. Go Bearcats tonight, and we will talk with you next week.
Take
Take
care.
care, Dan.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Dan.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.